appreciate that opportunity. And I appreciate the opportunity for me to be able to come here and speak to you. I've been asked to talk just a little bit about my experiences serving in the military. And so I'll just kind of talk a little bit about myself. It's not really about me, it's about all of our service. Just each of us have a different story for those that have served in the military and their families' experiences. I was born in July of 1977, and at that time my father was in the Army. He had been in the Army for about 8 months, and we were living in Fort Jackson, South Carolina at the time. This is where my experience in the military began. But in order for me to talk about my experiences, I have to talk about those who came before me in order to kind of talk about my experiences, because they encompass my experiences. The year was 1943 and the month was May. World War II had been waging for 4 years, and we did not know how it was going to end or who was going to be triumphant in the war at that time. My grandfather was 18 years old. He had just graduated from high school, and the joke that he tells us as kids is that I got my diploma in one hand and my draft papers in the other. And he joined the Army and became an Army infantryman. And that is where my experiences began as, for me as a child, growing up learning about my grandfather serving in World War II as a veteran. He got over to North Africa after the major conflicts that they had there, and that's where they branched off for the fight north of Rome when they went into Florence and Pisa. He was in that initial fight going through there. He tells us that after about 6 months of fighting, he was promoted all the way up to staff sergeant, and so he was in charge of his squad. He didn't have a platoon leader because they just couldn't keep him in at the time. And he told us, he's like, the reason that happened is because all the ones ahead of him were killed or wounded in battle and couldn't continue on, and so he had to make it up through the ranks that way. So one of the stories that we have is that when they moved into Pisa, the Germans were calling in very effective fires on the Allied forces. And my grandfather was part of the 92nd Infantry Division, and what they found out is they discovered is the Germans were using the Leaning Tower of Pisa as their outpost to be able to call on those fires. Because obviously in that area, I don't know if anybody have been there before, but if you go up to the top of the Leaning Tower of Pisa, you have a very, very good view of the surrounding area, and it gives you a 360 view. The Germans were very good at using places like this because they knew that it would be hard for us to decide when to destroy it, and they hoped that we wouldn't destroy it. We had destroyed many important historical sites already, most of that because of the use the Germans were using. But this was, they moved into Pisa, they put explosives around the Leaning Tower of Pisa, they moved back, and my grandfather called in to hire to get the green light to detonate. And as all of you can imagine, it didn't happen because he was told not to do it because it's too great of a historical site. Now my grandfather regrets that. He wishes he had just blown it without calling back. The reason I say that is on their way back, now the Germans knew that they were in the area and his squad was ambushed. He lost his best friend and a couple of his other soldiers were wounded in the fight. And I mean, in his mind, he believes that if they had blown it, they wouldn't have known where they were. It would have put them into confusion. But those are some of the things that I learned about my grandfather. Several months after this event happened, about a month before the Germans surrendered, my grandfather was in another fight, and they were taking a bridge, and we've got the citation hanging on our wall at home because these are the experiences that we have of my grandfather and the great things that he's done. They had a German, gun pit there. They went and they took the bridge. My grandfather was wounded early in the battle, but he continued to lead his men and take out the gun pit, the machine gun pit, and they took the bridge and kept it from the Germans blowing it up. He received a Bronze Star and a Purple Heart, Bronze Star for Valor. And I tell you these stories because those are the experiences that I grew up with. It's what I learned about as a child, about my grandfather and about the hero that he was to me. In 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait. At the time I was living in Germany, and my dad had been in the military now for about 14 years. During the buildup of forces, my father was called up to deploy to the first Gulf War. He was deploying up to Saudi Arabia. And at the time, we didn't really know the last major conflict that we had had with the military was the Vietnam War. And so we were really scared about what was going to happen. and what was going to happen to him, what was going to happen to the soldiers. And at the time, I was living on a military base. I went to a military high school, and so all the kids that I went to school with, all their dads were deploying as well. And it was a very scary time for all of us. But in typical Army fashion, my dad was called up and then came home and called up and came home and called up and came home. And every time that he left, it just never felt like he was really going to leave. I don't know, maybe it just didn't feel right. But then finally the orders came and it was certain that he was going to leave. And we went as a family to a small little outpost in Germany. They had a little ceremony before they left. And we then, as a family, moved off to a quiet, secluded part of this base. And we surrounded my father, me, my mom, and my 3 brothers, and we just hugged him and cried. We had no idea what was going to happen. And because we loved our dad, we wanted him to come home. Luckily, that battle, the first Gulf War, was fairly successful for us. Not so successful for the Iraqis. But my father was able to come home safely. Little did I know that 19 years later I'd be experiencing something very similar when I was called off to go to Afghanistan. So for me, my military experience started in 1996. I joined the Air Force initially. I did my 4 years active duty in the Air Force and got out in 2000 and had no intention of going back into the military. I was using the education benefits to go to school. And then, as we all know, on September 11th, something happened that, changed our world. At that point, I realized that I needed to go back into the military. And so, after doing a lot of soul searching, I joined the Army and got a commission with the Utah Army National Guard. And several years later, I received my orders to head out to Afghanistan in 2009 to serve, and I was there augmenting the Ranger Regiment. I'm an intelligence officer. And we went there, and I deployed to Forward Operating Base Salerno, which is very close to Pakistan. Everybody always talks about the Taliban. In that region of Afghanistan, the enemy was the Haqqanis. It was more like a mafia group. But they did all the fighting in the region of Afghanistan there. And they fought almost exclusively out of Pakistan. But there I served with some of the most elite special operations soldiers in the world. And since I was an intelligence guy, I can't tell you anything about it. I'm just kidding. But it was an exciting and terrifying experience for me. Going to war is different than watching your father going to war. I remember as I was getting ready to leave, me and my wife was taking me up to the airport. It was very low-key. I was getting on a plane and going to Benning, and then I was going to fly out from there, which is in Georgia, for those that don't know. And I went going around giving my kids a hug, and my second daughter, who was 8 at the time, she's up here in the audience, I gave her a hug and told her I was leaving, and she started to cry, and I was like, "What's wrong, honey?" And she's like, "Are you going to die, Dad?" Those are the experiences that you have being a soldier. And now I kind of understood what my dad may have been going through when we were on that little base in Germany in 1990 when I was hugging my dad and crying. So I told her, "No, I'm going to be okay," and I got her up and I had her come with me to the airport so we can laugh and joke and tell stories on the way and help to calm her down as an 8-year-old trying to understand what was going on and why her dad was going off to some country all the way on the other side of the world. For the 41 years that I've been alive, I've been in the military for 39 of them. Because my dad was in the military before I was born. I joined the military before my dad got out, and the rest is history, kind of like what I've told you. In politics, we hear a lot about the 1%, and usually they're talking about the 1% wealthiest people in society. But in the military, the 1% means something completely different to us. It's the 1% of us that are willing to risk our lives and to lay down our lives for our country and to join the military. Only 1% of our country has ever served in the military. But when you look at that number is usually much different, because if you look at just like my family, my grandfather served, my dad served, my older brother is in the Army, and I'm in the Army. And then if you look on my wife's side of the family, and I kind of went over this with her last night, so her grandfather served, her father served, she has 2 brothers that are currently serving, she has 4 uncles that served, and her history goes back to World War I, to the Civil War and the Revolutionary War. So that 1%, if you look at just families, it becomes much smaller. The number of people that serve, it becomes a tradition. People look up to those that have served before them. So you may ask, why do I serve? Why do people serve? And I guarantee that probably a lot of them have the same answer that I have. I serve because I love my country. I serve because I love our freedoms granted to us by the Constitution. I serve because the horrible experiences that I've experienced in war, I never want them to come to our cities, our streets, or our homes. I serve because I love our communities. I serve because I love my family. My family and the families of the veterans that are here, they're the silent heroes. They're the ones that have to do it while we're off in some foreign land, fighting for our country, ensuring that it doesn't come back here to us. They're the heroes. I serve for the true heroes, the ones that did not come home, those who gave the ultimate sacrifice for their country, those like Major Brent Taylor. And I love the scripture in John 15:13, where a greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. I serve for one word, and this one word sums up my experience in the military: love. Thank you, and God bless.